Top of the morning, Dan and Amy and Zeke Emanuel, one of the Emanuel brothers, along with Groucho and Zeppo. He's the doctor. He's Mr. 75 and out.
Yeah, he's been on this program a few times.
He has.
Yeah.
We've sparred. We'll have to have him back. Now's a good time as any, because he's concerned that President Trump will issue an emergency authorization in October as his October surprise to emergency use authorization for some vaccine for COVID-19 that is not sufficiently tested in order to declare victory in advance of the November 3rd election. It has the potential to be a travesty, writes Ezekiel Emanuel. Millions of vaccines could be distributed without proof the vaccine can prevent disease or transmission. So he's very concerned about Trump playing fast and loose with the science. Gosh, imagine a politician playing fast and loose with the science in the era of COVID-19. That would be remarkable, wouldn't it?
This should be celebrated. That's a good thing.
It's a good
the
thing.
Democrats want the economy to fail, to hurt Trump, and now this possibility of a vaccine.
Well, right. Zeke Emanuel saying if there wasn't really a vaccine, but Trump is going to bum rush America with one that has not been properly vetted, hasn't properly cleared all the clinical trials necessary for FDA approval, just for political reasons. It seems like, though, to your point, that Zeke Emanuel is rooting against a vaccine for political reasons. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Wesley Smith. Of course, he is an author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. We often have him on the show to talk about assisted suicide, but since we're in the business of not needing assistance to commit cultural suicide in this country, this seems like as good a topic as any. Wesley, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning, Dan and Amy.
Yeah, you say it's my sunny disposition this morning. I'm sure you picked up on that. So Zeke Emanuel, you did a little write-up on this for National Review. And you noted, of course, that this is just an assertion of Zeke Emanuel's, much like the candidate he's advising, who just asserts that Trump is going to somehow postpone the November 3rd election without evidence. But that's okay for New York Times publication standards.
Yeah, and one of the things when I saw that piece, I thought, this is just hysteria. And I have been following Ezekiel Emanuel for a long time because I accept that he's against assisted suicide, interestingly. I am against virtually every one of his positions. He's a technocrat par excellence, meaning he really would like to see authoritarian control in the name of protecting health and wellness in this country with rule by experts. And so when I saw that he had written this piece in the New York Times, I read it and I thought, this is ridiculous. He has no evidence that Trump could do that. There's no even reason to think that if Trump wanted to do that he actually could, because, you do have Dr. Fauci who would say, wait a minute. And you would have to go through the FDA. Other countries would say, wait a second, this thing hasn't even been tested.
Well, not to mention the drug maker themselves, so wouldn't want the liability exposure.
No.
Exactly. So, the idea is preposterous. But then I noticed, because Ezekiel Emanuel is one of the major, in fact, perhaps the major healthcare advisor to the Biden campaign, and I think a potential to become, if Biden wins, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So I thought, if you're going to have a charge in the New York Times which has destroyed its own credibility by basically allowing adversarial journalists or advocates journalists become advocates and pundits on the news pages, wouldn't you think that you should at least disclose to the reader that Emanuel is an advisor to the Biden campaign when you're making such a strong charge against the president? And of course, they do not disclose that. Because why do anything that would get in the way of the Get Trump agenda, which is what the New York Times is all about these days?
Speaking on the topic of coronavirus, it's worth noting in this time of reopening, many states, some states going faster than others, I suppose I should say. Robert Dingwall over the weekend, he is part of the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group that is advising the British government, saying that, the social distancing, the 2 meters or 6 feet, let's get off metric here. There's never been a scientific basis for 2 meters. It's kind of a rule of thumb, but it's not like there's a whole kind of rigorous scientific literature that it's founded upon, saying that we cannot sustain social distancing measures without causing serious damage to society, to the economy, and to the physical and mental health of the population. We've actually known that there's no science behind the 6 feet, but where was this guy and other medical professionals for the last 3 months?
Well, that's a good question, and this is the conundrum that we face. People like Dr. Fauci, who are dealing strictly with the pandemic aspect, meaning the viral aspect of what we're going through, they're going to just focus on that one part of the equation. But as Fauci has actually said in one of his news conferences, President Trump and government leaders have to look at the entire picture. And part of this entire picture is, how do we keep this society from imploding to the point where you have a Great Depression, which would increase suicides, which would increase opioid addictions, which would increase divorces, which would be just a disaster for this country. And so you really have, I'm kind of reminded of during the Civil War, and I'm not comparing President Trump to President Lincoln, but President Lincoln had so many balls in the air at once that he had to deal with. And this is one of those kind of crisis moments in which the current president has so many balls in the air, and trying to find just the right way of juggling them so that they all don't hit the ground, if you can use that metaphor, is really a difficult part. And part of it is reopening the economy. Just today I was watching the Maria Bartiromo morning show on Fox Business News, and apparently there's been a huge increase in retail sales. That's wonderful. Yet I worry that there are people in this society who, whether for political reasons or fear of illness and so forth, would rather dampen our ability to thrive in the name of fighting disease, and we can't allow that to happen either.
Yeah, I saw your tweet when you said she with a dour and with a smile on her face and warm presentation.
That was one of their guests. I watched this show because I think it's one of the best interview shows on television every morning, and that particular guest is always pessimistic. It's always going to get worse. So I was kind of enjoying myself with that little tweet.
Well, do you ever see a time, in the near future, maybe a few years or a few months, where we'll get back to normal here, or do we really have to wait for a vaccine, as most politicians say?
I don't think you can. There's no guarantee there'll ever be a vaccine. Yep. I think we all what I've been writing about is stopping mandates. Like, for example, Ezekiel Emanuel and others might actually want to have a mandate for a vaccine if it ever came available. Alan Dershowitz actually said that the government has the right to grab you, force you into your doctor's office, and have a needle poked into your arm. Well, I disagree with that completely, and I've written about that. But should we, if we have a mandate, how do we, a vaccine, how do we deal with it? Well, it seems to me that the smart way to go about it would be, well, who's most at risk of lethal illness from the COVID? Well, that would be people like my mother-in-law, who's in a nursing home, the elderly, the frail, people with comorbidity. So wouldn't we want to prioritize any vaccine to that cadre of people if they want to receive it? And after that, anybody else who wants to receive it should. But I don't think we should be forced to ever all receive the COVID vaccine, because we're not dealing with smallpox here.
Well, and there's a good piece by a couple of research fellows, one at Stanford's Hoover Institute, the other at the Naval Postgraduate School, and the Wall Street Journal, about the data. A team of economists from MIT published the results of a study that compared various alternative strategies for limiting the spread. They concluded twice as many lives could be saved if governments focused limited resources on protecting the most vulnerable people rather than squandering them on those who seem to face almost no risks, such as children, which is to your point about vaccine prioritization, and also to the larger point about, not being confined to the binaries that the politicians have set forward, social distance or not social distance, but being open-ended with respect to what are the best policies that provide the best trade-offs for humanity. And those questions seem to have been completely lost as you've just turned half the population into parrots repeating lines they hear politicians speak on TV.
Yeah, and what's really disturbing is what New York, New Jersey, and some other places where the worst of the disease occurred, and yet the governor of New York issued an order requiring infected COVID patients to be accepted by nursing homes, which led to a devastation in those homes, thousands of deaths. And that is something that I think is really a problem, because the implication of that order is that we care about elderly people and frail people less than we care about other people. And that's a form of invidious discrimination that I think we have to really be careful about when we are dealing with any kind of serious pandemic or epidemic.
Yeah, I mean, there's no lessons learned from New York State, the epicenter of the outbreak. It's remarkable. Cuomo's the nation's governor, according to the reporting I see on CNN and MSNBC, largely in the New York Times. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had a huge expose on Friday that was rather devastating for the small percentage of people that read it, about New York State's response, not just with respect to reintroducing the infected into nursing homes, which was the most catastrophic decision that governors, and it wasn't just Cuomo, it was Wolf in Pennsylvania, it was Whitmer in Michigan, the worst decision that governors made, and it gets barely any coverage because the worst offenders were Democrats. In addition to that, there was the squabbling going on between Cuomo and de Blasio, where they're sort of playing the yardstick game rather than focusing on making decisions in a coordinated fashion between the state and the city. And not all of this is papered over by the press corps. And frankly, conservative outlets haven't done a good enough job of profiling this either.
Yeah, and there's another problem we have is the collapse of trust in institutions. So you saw, just as one example, the yelling about you can't have any kind of close contact during the pandemic. And then when the demonstrations and mass demonstrations took place in the wake of the death of George Floyd, suddenly that was over. And you actually had de Blasio's family participating in some of these marches. You saw, I believe, the governor of Michigan. And then as soon as those demonstrations are over, as I saw one commentator say, well, suddenly they remembered COVID. Well, you can't have that kind of hypocrisy without people noticing. And when you have that kind of hypocrisy and double standard, the credibility of the institution collapses. Here's another example. The World Health Organization, and I wrote about this, they issued a statement one day saying that transmission from people who are asymptomatic is, quote, very rare, close quote, which is really, if that's true, it's an excellent thing, because that means that the disease is far less dangerous than people suppose, because people were so worried that asymptomatic people could actually spread the disease not knowing they were ill. Well, suddenly, because that might help one side of the political argument, the pressure, you could see it, the pressure was on the WHO. Take it back, take it back.
Yep.
And guess what? The very next day they took it back. Oh, well, actually, this is what it's true, and that 16% of the people who are asymptomatic and spread the disease, or whatever they said it was. So you had no credibility from the WHO, because you know that they're political, and of course we knew that before when they hid what China was doing. When you have our major institutions engaging in that kind of clear political bias or incompetence, I don't know which, people lose faith in institutions. And that leads to a real problem in civic society, because our institutions aren't there to tell us what to do, but they're there to give us leadership and advice so we can follow when that's our desire. And who do you follow these days? It's very difficult to know.
Since you write so much on the topic of bioethics, what about, and it's remarkable coming from the crowd it's coming from too, with respect to their general positions on life in the womb and life at the end of life, but the everything to save one life. If you save one life, Wesley, that should be the basis of our public policy.
Right, and even though that everything to save one life might cost $5,000 on the other side, it doesn't matter. That's just a bromide. That's just a little slogan that people use to justify everything. Here's a larger problem. We've become a society that feels instead of thinks, and when you feel, when what is right or wrong at a particular moment is based on your feelings, there's no principles involved, because your feelings are your feelings. They're transitory. What you think is right today what you feel is right today, you may not feel is right tomorrow. That's why thinking becomes important. And I always try to not say, how do you feel about this? I always try to say, what do you think about this? Because I think that distinction is really crucial. And I think as a society, we need to feel less and ponder and have principles and follow ideas more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question. The sentimentality leads to the descent into barbarism. Wesley Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. Wesley, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and hello to the Windy City.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Sometimes when it rains, it pours right into your basement. This is Gus